Okay, so guys, welcome to the lesson 2 of Technical Features. This week, we'll be covering 2 topics on resume tips and behavioral questions. Yeah, well, let's dive right into resume. So kind of motivation for kind of going over this topic is there are 2 motivations here. One, resume screening evaluates whether a candidate's skills, experience, and education is suitable for a role. And this is going to be like looked by, getting checked by the recruiters, or sometimes even these like screening, HR screening software. So, having a great resumes can draw the attention of an interviewer and help you get the next round of an interview. So it's really important to have a resume set up right, and and actually get you set up for a conversation with the recruiter. So to set up like resume, there are like a lot of common questions around different things. So 4 different themes here. Here are one, like length. The question is around like how long do I make my resume? There's also a second theme around content. It is like, what do I write in my resume? 3, like there's also a question about styles. It's like, how do I write my experience and accomplishments so they stand out and grab the attention of those interviewers? And lastly, this organization. How can I organize my resume so that they look clean and just present yourself as like an organized person, right? So we'll kind of go over all of these 4 themes today and dive also deeper into some of these questions here. So first tip on length. We get a lot of questions on, how long do I want to make my resume? Oftentimes you want to show yourself as like a really capable and experienced person, and you want to write a lot of details that may go over 1 page. But our official recommendation here is to keep it to just 1 page. And this is because like as a junior or less experienced candidate, 1 page should be all you need to kind of like fit all this experiences and details of what you have done. And this is also one major reason is that recruiters also only spend a short fixed amount of time. It's usually somewhere from like 20 to 30 seconds from like a lot of places to just like scan through your resume and see if you'd be a good fit for the role. And then so that's why you want to be able to like keep it concise and focus on summarizing your accomplishment in the easily digestible format. And for the content here, these are kind of things that you need to include. This is just like one of the recommended styles of content, but first you want to start off with like a name and contact at the top. And then as like a recent grad or soon to be grad, you want to put like the education at the top, just to kind of like mention what you have studied and what you have studied there. And then later on, you can move on to like work experiences. If you have like worked in like a school, like IT department for like a campus job, that would be a great thing to write down. If you also have a summer internship at a tech place or even a non-tech place working some technical capability, that's also good to put down. And if you haven't done any of those things and have just worked at a like regular summer job, that's totally fine too. And we'll kind of go over those details later. And after the work experience, there are 2 more things they want to put down. One of them is project. So oftentimes the younger candidate doesn't really have like that much work experience, and education could be really simple, just like a one-liner about like what college they went to. So if you really want to pad your resume, this is like one area that you can kind of like dig into, which is like your side project or your school project that was like complex, but like really made you learn a lot. You can write down, hey, what kind of like languages and what you have done in those projects, so that you can also convey that you have kind of gone through those challenges and understand the complexity of building softwares. And lastly, you could also put down like a section on skills or different coding languages that you know. This is also good for both human like recruiters, like actually understand what you know. And we also recommend this because a lot of like large companies also rely on these like HR softwares that I just mentioned that like scans for like certain keywords. So for example, if a company is really hiring for like a Java developer, they might run a software that, that looks for like the word Java or keyword Java in your resume. And if it doesn't see it, it may just automatically pass on you. And that's unfortunate, even if you stand out as a great candidate, but it is just something that some companies are doing to make that recruiting process more efficient. So So that's why, yeah, it's also important to have a section that will like list your skills and languages that you know. And here you also want to like match, whatever keywords or roles that they're looking for, and make sure, your resume will have them if you actually have those skills. All right, and then to kind of like go deeper into the work experience. So as I mentioned a little before, you want to kind of prioritize on including the roles that are relevant to engineering. And that's fine if you don't have them yet. If you're like, let's say, a junior or senior and just haven't really had a chance to do a technical role, but have just like picked up a like a regular summer job to make sure you can pay for the tuition, that's totally fine. You can just put down, hey, for example, I worked at Mitchell's Ice Cream over the summer as like ice cream server. And yeah, and you can also spin this in a positive way too. Like here you can say, hey, I worked here during my freshman summer and served thousands of ice cream to customers. And this is like why I learned the importance of customer support or customer service. And you may not really need customer support in a software, but having that kind of mindset to think about, okay, what can I do the best for my customers? That's going to apply to like, any kind of businesses. So you can also like, spin this kind of like a non-technical roles experience into like a positive way to make it a little more relevant to the roles that you're applying for. And even, of course, even better is like if you actually had some type of a technical engineering role, that'd be really good to put it down. Even if it's like an IT role at a college library, you can also put it down and you can say, hey, I actually manage like a set of computers in this location on my campus. And this is like, what I learned and stuff like that. And moving on to projects. So this is where you can also like write things to kind of present yourself as more experience, despite the fact that, you may not have that many work experience early on in your career yet. So you can include things like, 2 to 4 most significant projects you have worked on, both like inside of school and outside of school. And here you just want to state what the project was and what languages or technologies was used, and if you could also fit it, what you learned from it. So yeah, projects will be a good place to put down if you feel like you're a little bit lacking on the work experience side. And lastly, skills. So yeah, this is pretty straightforward. You just want to write down the skills to increase your chance of being seen as a good fit. So if you have like technical software that you know how to use outside of coding languages, that's great too. So you can put down things like Linux, Visual Studio, IntelliJ, Xcode. That's all fine. And even great would be if you actually know the programming languages or technologies you could put it. One way is you can just put it down as like a list, or you could also kind of organize in a table format. There are actually a lot of them. So then, you can like really utilize that, space in the resume to put down as many keywords as possible. Here, but you also don't want to put down everything. For example, if I am a novice C++ programmer, which I actually am, just for the community here. I probably wouldn't put down C++ on my resume just because if I were to get asked about C++ questions, I wouldn't be able to answer them, deeply. But any language that I feel I'm an expert or like a proficient on, I would definitely put it on a resume. So example here is like you could also like note how much of like experience you have here by saying, hey, with Java, I feel like I'm an expert since I have like worked on it for years. But then for like let's say C++ or Python, I'm a little bit like comfortable in, but I also know how to write code. In which case you can also write some words like proficient, just to kind of like note that, hey, I know this, I can write code, but I just don't know as much as just like, how much I know Java, for example. And then if you're also familiar with certain front end or back end framework, there are also some good keywords to put it down there. So HTML or CSS, they're kind of like serve as like a backbone of like the web development. So you can kind of put it down like that. If you also know like certain like latest frameworks such as React or Angular, that's also good to put it down. And on the backend side, I'm sure like a lot of you guys have also worked on like different database, things like Postgres, MySQL, MongoDB. Those are all good things to put it in there. Okay, well, any questions so far on with regards to the resume tips and the content?
I saw a question in the chat from Horatio. He was asking about leadership section with clubs, and what I said was, if it's like, if you're in like technical clubs, and that fits well below projects, because like it's a similar experience that you can show. But if it's not, then I think it's up to you whether you want to put skills above it or not. I don't know, Wenta, what you think.
Yeah, yeah, I'd probably share the same sentiment. Yeah, if it's like a leader of like a technical club, like for example, a computer science club, I think that would probably be the best kind of leadership role that you could put it on a resume. Otherwise, it also depends on how much space you have left and what kind of message you want to convey on resume. But if you feel like, hey, I would like, let's say you are like a leader of like a volunteering community at school, and you feel like that would actually convey like what how much of a responsible person you are, then I think that would be a like a positive plus too. Um, yeah, so I kind of like share the sentiment that Karen just shared, which is like it also like depends on what kind of message you want to convey on your resume. So
it's good. Thank you.
All right, any other questions? All right, if not, we'll move on and get on to desktop technical styles. So styling is about how you want to convey the same message to the reader of your resume. So one thing that you really want to make sure you want to do is you want to really write in a strong bullet point. So not only do you want to tell what you did, you really want to focus on your accomplishments here. And you can do that by like saying what you did, how you did it, and especially if there was any results, what the results were. So one example format is you could say in a bullet point, hey, I accomplished X by implementing Y, which led to Z. Where Z will be like some results that you you kind of created for the organization or the team that you're working for. And that's really fine. Like once again, if you didn't really have an internship that really allows you to show this kind of like results, you could also kind of like probably like mention your class project, for example. I basically created this, let's say like a query planner in like a database system, which led to, let's say, a reduction in query compilation time from like a couple of seconds to like a couple of milliseconds. If you really have some like specific formats like results like that in your projects, that's also good to put it down. If like for some reason you really can't think of like any results, then that's fine. You could still like say something like, hey, I accomplished like building this database query planner inside like, let's say like a Postgres database, for example. And that would still show that okay, you have done some complex projects within certain technologies, and that could still give like positive signals to your interviewer. Yep. So here's some examples. So like an okay way to kind of like say some accomplishment is like, hey, you can just simply say it's like, okay, I built a data exploration tool, and just end it there. But something better to say, or a better way to say this would be, I address companies' data discovery issue by building a data exploration tool. So here you can see that you're kind of bringing in what issue you solved by building this tool for a company. So that's even better because now you're kind of like bringing like the business objective into your bullet point. And like a kind of the best way to kind of put it would be, hey, if you say, hi, I addressed company's data discovery issue by building a data exploration tool that led to 20% reduction in bug reports related to data issues. Now, like not only are you bringing in like a business like goals in here, you also like have like a hard evidence or hard stats to back up, what kind of improvement you brought by building this tool. So yeah, so that would be like a really strong point that you can like convey to your interviewer. All right, and now moving into organization. So here are like a couple of simple tips that we have for you. One, you kind of want to have a clearly divided sections to basically separate out different sections of your resume. You also want to have a consistent spacing. Make sure like bullet points like started in the right, like, spacing away from the left-hand side, stuff like that. Usually sometimes I would get a resume that would be like kind of like looks like a jigsaw puzzle, and that definitely doesn't look like a good thing to look at. Let's see. Otherwise, you also want to make sure that they're horizontally aligned. Um, so yeah, it's kind of also related to spacing, but make sure like both left-hand side and right-hand side kind of like start and end at the expected places. And lastly, you want to have like a good font. So make sure you use like a legible font that will be easy to read. Any kind of cursive writing or like any kind of like fun ones such as like Comic Sans, which I'm sure we all love to use during our middle school essays. Yeah, please stay away from that, and try to use like something simple. Like you can't ever go wrong with like using Arial or Times New Roman, but there's like other similar font that you love to use, but they'll also stand as legible. Yeah, just feel free to use that as well. Let's see. So yeah, and then there's also a couple of resources. So if you click on this link over here, we have a template that you can kind of like that is hosted on Google Drive or Google Doc. So you can kind of like make a copy of it and start like making your own resume. If you are into more of like relying on a service to do it, Indeed has a resume builder. So that has like certain templates. So you also kind of like feel free to also visit this website, use their service, and like just fill out all the details about yourself. This is all available for free. So I thought it would be a helpful resources as you kind of build this resume of yours. All right, so that kind of covers all the resume content, but any questions? All right, so I'm just seeing a chat. It seems like it does a lot, so.
Okay, I think I see a couple questions. Let's see. Where did that 20% come from? Do you want to go back to the resume example you had?
Oh yeah, so where did that 20% come from? That's just an example. Here we go. Horatio was asking about, hey, where did this number come from? This is just an example, but I will say, hey, like as you're working on school projects or like a company, like intern project, try to pay attention to like, what is the objectives and like what are the actual improvements or improvements that you actually bring in with your project, right? So in this case, like, hey, for example, this is actually like an example from my own internship, and this 20% number is more like an example one. But for example, like during one of my summer internships, I had to build this internal data exploration tool that was going to basically scan all the metadata that the databases within the company, and you had to basically kind of like do this thing like create a like Wikipedia page, and that also like kind of shows like, okay, what are the columns and like what are different like last refresh time is and stuff like that. And the whole kind of point, this was like, was just not that I can have fun with this, but it was because like company had this data discovery issue, which they thought could be improved by, having me, the intern, build this tool. And kind of like the final results of this like project could be that, we could, with this tool, like we kind of reduce like a bug reports related data issues, because now people have like less data issues by using this tool, for example. So this is just an example number once again, but what I recommend is if you don't have these like hard stats, like really, try to pay attention and think about, hey, what are some like key impacts that could come out of my projects? So then next time you're updating your resume, you could also like write those things down.
Yeah, and it's also like not necessarily something that you would have like when you're working on your project as an intern, you might not necessarily know the direct impact. So that's why like working with your team, working with some of the other engineers. So like say you're working on a new feature, and then working with like the on-call engineers, working with your manager to understand like, okay, what is the impact of this feature or project that I'm working on? That helps a lot to get like a sense of some form of the impact. Like even if you can't quantify it, I mean, quantifying is always ideal, but it's not always possible. So don't feel pressured to like have it be quantified. So yeah, that's a great question by Horatio. And then Gerard asked, do resumes made with latex get messed up when scanned by resume softwares? Not necessarily, because I think there was another question below. If it's all PDF, it's all the same. So that should not be an issue.
Yep. Yeah, I would definitely recommend kind of like exporting as a PDF and uploading as PDF. I had a couple of experiences, both of the candidate and also like on sitting on the other side, like reading people's like resume where format got messed up when they were uploading in like a Google Doc format or even like Microsoft like Doc format. So I think having like a like kind of a static copy as a PDF is probably the safest bet when you're uploading your resume.
Yep, exactly.
All
Good
right.
questions, though. These are all good questions. Any other ones before we go? I saw Sophia posted a link with resume action words. That's awesome.
That's great. Yep, Muse is a good website. Thank you for posting this. All right. Any other questions?
I think we're going to keep going.
All right. If not, we'll kind of like keep the train going then. So now we'll move on to covering behavior questions. So what are the motivations here? Once again, there are two main motivation. One is that, hey, you would most likely get asked by interviewers like get to know your personality, understand your resume more properly, and or just ease into an interview. So usually when you first start off an interview, there might be like a first 5 to 10 minutes component where interviewers will like not ask you these technical questions, but also just really ask you, hey, tell me about yourself, or like, tell me about like hardest project you worked on, and tell me how you kind of like resolve those challenges and stuff like that. And depending on what companies you're applying, those conversations could be like much longer because that might be the key things that they want to focus on. So that's why we want to be prepared to like answer these questions to give good signals to the interviewer that you'll be a good colleague to work with. So common patterns. So how do you recognize that I'm being asked a behavior question? So behavior questions often start in the following ways, and this is just not exclusive to like these like 5 bullet points, but these are just some of the common questions. But they include things like, hey, tell me about a time when something happened, or like it could also start with like what do you do when something why happens. It could also be like have you ever done, or have you ever experienced this issue. Or they could also ask you, hey, give an example of the time, like let's say when you had a trouble with your teammates, and how did you resolve it? And lastly, you could also like be like, hey, describe a situation when you were not gonna submit a project on time. How did you deal with it, right? So these are kind of like some of the ways in which like this behavioral question could start off. So I think it's helpful to be able to recognize them. And yep, so kind of went over some of the example questions, but hey, you could kind of read it off here, but they include things like, hey, tell me about a time when you had to prioritize on different tasks, right? So this kind of question could like gauge how good you are at multitasking, or just basically assigning priorities to different tasks, right? Conflict resolution also a pretty big theme when it comes to job interviews. So you could be asked things like, hey, what do you do when you face a conflict with a teammate who's behind on their work, right? And you want to be able to answer that's going to make you sound like a good colleague to work with. And if you kind of like sound off like being very hostile in this kind of situation, that could like kind of give like negative signals to the interviewers. So yeah, so you want to be prepared to like answer these kind of questions. And then there's like another example question. So yeah, describe a time in which you had done something differently. This also kind of like gauges how good you are at like reflecting and learning from mistakes. So yeah, I would say, hey, unless it's like a really big mistake that you would be embarrassed to tell people about, you could be really honest here and yeah, just like tell them, hey, what is something that you did, what is something that you didn't do right in the first time around, but you learn from that mistake, and so that next time around you could do that thing yeah, you could do that thing better and stuff. All right, so there are a bunch of these questions that you may be asked, and there are definitely certain strategies that you could use to answer those questions. So key strategy here, there are 3 steps here. First step is you want to pick the right story. So things to do here is like you want to be able to prepare stories that could highlight your soft skills like teamwork, communication, time management, resilience, and so on. And interviewers, they also want to like have like kind of like one of those like gotcha questions where they want to also like sometimes fish out how you basically behaved during those like really stressful situations. So you also want to be prepared for like those negative questions that interviewers want to would sometimes ask you, so that they also know how you handle conflicts. So that's like step 1. You basically want to kind of like think about your experiences, both like in school and outside of school, so that you have like these like anecdotes or stories to tell to the interviewer. And then step 2 here is that you want to make a statement. So here you can make a statement that can lead to sharing what you learn from it. We're all humans, we'll all make mistakes from time to time, but as long as you learn from it and make improvements over time, I'm sure like a lot of people are actually open to that, open to you making mistakes and like improving from it. So you want to be able to like state that, hey, this is what you learned, so that you're the type of person that's not going to make the same mistake. Yeah, and just don't make it about whether you're right, but just how you grew from it. I know like some people, including myself actually, wants to be right most of the time. That makes me feel good that I'm making like good decisions. But you kind of want to get away from that framework and just like, not care about like you're putting blames on anyone, but just like, focus on like how you grew from it, right? So that it becomes more of a positive story, even from like this like negative situation. And lastly, step 3, you want to finish strong. So once you kind of tell this story to the company, you want to explain how that experience will be useful, right? So for example, like, you have this like project where like things just didn't go with your teammates. But from that negative experience, like let's say you learn how to do time management or communication better, then like tie it back to those themes and like just emphasize those things, and just like say, yeah, these are the things that I learned from this experience, right? And then lastly, if you have a short summary to tell from a story that ended up being long, then yeah, that's also like a good way to kind of remind the interviewer the kind of like the positive things that came out of it. So this is a strategy. And there are also techniques here. There's like this one famous method called the STAR method. It's really easy to remember because each letter and star stands for something. So STAR method is a simple framework that can help you tell a meaningful story about a previous work experience. And to kind of go over what each letter stands for, S stands for situation. So with situation, you want to set the scene and give the necessary details to your example. So this is like kind of like related to just like collecting all the stories you have, but you want to kind of paint the picture of the situation that you went through for your interviewer so that they can actually picture it themselves. And moving on to the next letter, T. T stands for task. For task, you want to describe what your responsibility was in that situation. So for class projects or for like internship project, you could say, hey, this was my responsibility. For example, you could say I was responsible for building the back end, or I was responsible for building the front end. And just describe, hey, what you were originally assigned to do, right? And then A is action. Then this is where you explain exactly what steps you took to address it. So if you were in charge of building the front end, you could say, hey, these were the steps that I took to build it, or these were the steps that I took to kind of like, solve this business challenge. And lastly, R is like results, which is like, you want to basically share what the outcomes of your actions were. So it's a pretty simple framework. You can remember as a start, S for situation, T for task, A for action, and R for results. So yeah, so back to this like previous slide on like picking the right story. and giving this like story to the interviewer. Make sure you kind of like use this framework of like STAR method to think about how you want to kind of convey the story in like a really impactful way to you to your listener.
Any questions here? Or actually, one, let's go through the example and then we can ask for questions.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so to dive into the example here, the example here would be like the interviewer could ask you something like, hey, tell me about a time when you had to coordinate a complex task with multiple stakeholders. I'm sure that happens a lot with like group class projects or even like an internship project where you're working with like a bunch of like other interns or even your senior colleagues. So using a STAR method, this is how you can tell a story. So with situation part, you could say, hey, in my previous job, I was working on a project and realized that colleagues from other teams that were also working on the same part of the code base. So we were like all rushing toward an important feature launch for the customers, right? So this was the situation. You could already start to imagine, well, it was a busy time and there were like basically multiple people from different teams working on the same part of the code base. So what is T here? Oh, the task. So task here is that I realized that we had to immediately start coordinating and identify which parts of the code need to be reconciled and which parts need to go in what order, right? So you could imagine, hey, if multiple people are working on the same parts of the code base, there's going to be like a merge conflict. And it's also important because people are probably working on different logic that's not going to mesh well, right? So the task here then becomes, okay, how do you reconcile that? And what order do you put them in? So then those different codes can be merged in like the correct orders and stuff. So that was the task or the responsibility. A or action here is, so what did I do here? Well, I messaged these colleagues as well as my team's manager to set up a group meeting. And to kind of make that group meeting go smoothly, I created a proposal doc about the steps that we could take to kind of like smoothly merge all these different code. And then lastly, you want to kind of like hone in on the results. So you could say, hey, at the group meeting, people saw my proposal. It came to consensus after like sharing more feedback, right? And then in the end, we executed based on a plan and got to launch the feature just a few days late. And which was not the ideal situation here, right? It was the feature launch still ended up being late. But you can kind of spin it in a positive way by saying, hey, while that wasn't ideal, but it was certainly better than facing further delays that we will have to face if we didn't flag this issue until later. So you could say, hey, this was a negative situation, but I think my action contributed to the issue not becoming any worse. And you could, in this kind of story, could like demonstrate the kind of initiative that you took to make the bad situation like slightly better. So yeah, so this is just an example of using STAR method to tell a story. See, any questions about this?
Question: What are considered stakeholders?
Oh, what are considered stakeholders? Yeah, so stakeholders is basically it's a very generic term, but you could kind of think about of like people who are basically whom you're like collaborating with on a day-to-day basis, or it could be someone that you're reporting to. So it's basically like you can kind of think of like people who are you in directly contact with, or who are you like or who you're reporting to, or that those people are responsible for your work. And this could be honestly in a business setting, this could go as high as like a CEO level, right? Like for example, let's say if Curran was working on preparing this like really important like revenue forecast report, that's going to be important for the CEO to present to the world. Then, well, even though maybe Curran doesn't report to the CEO directly, his work is going to like directly impact or indirectly impact the CEO, right? So you could see, well, in a sense, like the CEO is also like a stakeholder. And even for things like, feature launch, as an engineer, you mostly work with like other engineers or even like engineering manager. But feature launch is like something that even the marketing team also kind of like, waste a lot of importance on, because they also have like a certain date in their mind, and they want to like announce it to the customers that, hey, this is the date in which we would like release this like feature. And if this like feature or this date cannot be met, then it also makes the marketing team look poorly in the customer side. So also you could also say, well, in that sense, your work also has the marketing team as your stakeholder, because they also rely on your work to be done correctly and to be on time.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, but that was a good question. Any other questions?
What if you never experienced that?
Pardon?
What if you never there wasn't a time that you coordinated a complex task with multiple stakeholders? So you just
I
make
see.
it, yeah.
I see. In that case, let's see. Have you worked on like a group project with your classmates?
I mean, no, my school's most like independent work.
I see. I see. Well, that's totally fine. Like, this is just an example, but you could say, well, if you haven't really had a chance to work with like other classmates, even in school setting, then you could say, hey, you could, if I were you, I'd probably say, hey, unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to work with other stakeholders, but you could like spend it in a positive way by saying, hey, but I could tell you about the times where like I prioritize how I was going to go about doing this task to make sure it gets done on time, or to make sure it gets done in like a really, with good quality.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Yep. So you could also kind of like, if you don't have those episodes, you could also focus on yourself, facing other challenging tasks and how you went about it.
Yeah, for this section, you could do like group projects, assignments, any experience with clubs, like even if it's not technical. I mean, the context, ideally technical is great, but like if you have a non-technical example, that still shows like how you'd approach a problem. That's great. And then for like, if you are thinking about like internship experiences or things you've done outside of school, like it doesn't have to be like that fancy. It could be like something that was part of whatever your internship project was, and like who did you report to, like what was that like. Yeah, they're like even simple stories from like internships or like other projects you've done that you can spin into this.
Good, yeah.
All right, good question. All righty, so I have been kind of emphasizing the importance of kind of collecting all those like stories that you have went through, right? So this is like one other technique to help you do this. So you can like prepare this thing called story grid before the interview and practice using it. And what this would help you to do is like, this would help you reduce each story to just a couple of keywords that you can like write in like each cell of the script. And it helps you recall, yeah, what were those like stories and like what helped you, or like, learn, or like, what, and what you learned from it, for example. So yeah, so for example, like, some questions could be related around the themes around like, the most challenging one, or what you, so you could like write down, yeah, what were the most challenging like aspects of like, these different projects you worked on. And there'll be, oftentimes a question on like what you learned. So then you could also write down, hey, these are the key things that I learned from each one of these projects. What was the, and you could kind of go down each of these like, row that could ask, that correspond to like some of the questions that could be asked. So things like, okay, what was the most interesting aspect, or what's the hardest bug that you encountered in this project, right? So yeah, so if you want to have like a systemic way to go prepare like all these stories and how you want to convey that, you could fill this out. And then as you kind of practice, you're probably not gonna even need to kind of look at this and like be able to like tell those stories to interviewers. But as you, when you're first initially going about it, this is like another technique or tool that might be helpful for you. Alrighty. So yeah, you could, yeah, lastly, some other common questions that could be asked in an interview. You could be asked things like, hey, what are your weaknesses? Or what is the most challenging part of the project? Well, lastly, it could be very open-ended, which is like, hey, do you have any questions for me, right? So we'll also look at how you can answer some of these common questions. So on a question around, what are your weaknesses? here, like our recommendation is that you want to give a genuine answer, right? And the reason for this is because the genuine answer shows you that you have self-awareness and can be capable of making up for it. Yeah, it's honestly as simple as that. It's important to kind of like, in business setting, it's important to kind of like own up to your mistakes, and show signs that you can actually learn from it. So once again, don't be embarrassed about your mistakes. We all do. We all do make mistakes. So yeah, feel free to give a genuine answer to this question. So some example here, an okay answer would be, hey, I work too hard, right? I'm sure we have a lot of hard workers here hearing that, they're students who are taking summer classes or doing summer internships. But, I work too hard could be something that could be, that doesn't convey much, right? Because the kind of generic assumption here is that, hey, anyone that a company wants to hire, should be hard workers, right? So yeah, what are different ways in which you can like kind of tell about your weaknesses and still kind of like convey that you're a good candidate for the company? Well, this is just one example response, but hey, you could just like kind of highlight your like personality trait, right? So this is kind of like really related to my personality trait, but personally, I tend to be a very optimistic person. And while that kind of gives me confidence on like taking on challenges, sometimes that can also really get in the way of estimating a realistic project timeline. So because of it, I tend to remind myself there's tendency when estimating a timeline, and sometimes I ask my colleagues to check my assumption, right? So this is actually something that I actually do on my day-to-day job, which is when I'm like doing like a project a timeline estimate. Whatever I do, I'll probably multiply by like, a factor of 2, just to make sure like I have some margin of safety and account for factors that I didn't count before. Some example of factors that could really like throw the timeline off. Like for example, like the code base that I was working with, just like turned out that it was built in a way that was not scalable, for example, right? Or some other example could be, hey, you realize implementing a simple feature, like as simple as like, let's say checkboxes, requires you to like learn like a new framework or new like packages. That also takes extra time. So there are like all these things that could like really add to the software development time. And that also really like interferes with my kind of like a baseline optimistic trait. So then this is like why I kind of emphasize, hey, I'm aware of it and this is what I do to kind of correct what, right? So yeah, so this is like one way in which you can like kind of give a genuine answer about your weakness, and just also show, hey, how you like really correct what. So that way you both show the interviewer that you have self-awareness and how you're correcting for it. So any questions?
So basically, you say a weakness, and then you say how you're working towards straining that weakness.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. I think you start off with like an honest answer. I think one Cal gave a good example of like trying to say you're too hardworking or things like that. Like, don't start positively from the start. Like, you should be very open about what your answer is. So like, for instance, in case in the past, like I've said, oh, sometimes when I work, I get a little bogged down in like the details of the deliverable and like lose sight of like the collaboration piece. Like, what am I working on with my partners? And like sometimes that ends up messing up project timelines. And so that's something I've worked on over the past couple of years. So you should be very blunt at the start and then talk about, okay, well, how have I worked on it? And so like for me, I've worked in a lot of like collaborative based environments. I did consulting for 2 years after college. Now I work in like a strategy team at LinkedIn where I report to like some of our sales leadership. And so like that gets a lot more visibility. You force yourself to be more collaborative. And so as long as you can tell the story of here's like truth about me, and it's like, it's not ideal, but how am I working on it? And then like you have to show like an example of how you're working on it. But you shouldn't always say like, oh yeah, it's going to be handled. But you should say like, I'm still working on it. And like, here's how.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Eduardo, you put down this weakness is that I'm a perfectionist. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think I also hear this from a lot of people, and like one possible way in which to kind of like convey that in like a really kind of like informative way is that, being perfectionist means like, okay, you really pay attention to the details, right? And while you recognize that, okay, this could be really good in some projects, this kind of trait could also hurt in like really time sensitive projects, right? So this is like, you could basically say, hey, recognizing that I'm a perfectionist and like really pay attention to details, I really ask like what kind of operating mode will adopting for like a certain project, for like time sensitive project. Then what I do is like I try to turn away from this perfectionist mindset and try to adopt like an 80-20 mindset. 80-20 being, what is like the 20% effort thing that we can do to achieve 80% of outcome. It's also known as like a Pareto principle. So yeah, just like recognizing when to adopt different kind of mindset. Is important, and you could also try to kind of spin it that way.
Sounds good.
Well, I agree. I think we all have some weaknesses, right? And that's why, yeah, oftentimes we work in teams so that we have others to make up for our weaknesses.
One time, I'm going to put you on the spot right now. What is your weakness? If you were asked this question, what would you say?
Well, I already covered this optimistic one, and I shared it with everyone. I would say I also tend to get bogged down in details. So kind of like similar to what Eduardo said, tend to be also leaning on the perfectionist side and miss the picture about time sensitivity. So yeah, so I mean, that's kind of adopting different kind of operating mindset kind of thing. This is a recent conversation that I had with my own manager, right? And yeah, I guess like one other weakness that I haven't probably really shared with anyone is the fact that I may not be the best communicator. And also comes from the fact that I didn't grow up in a like an English speaking family household. I spoke Chinese and Japanese in my household. So I may not be able to express like some things as fluently or as clearly as some other people would, right? So how do I make up for this mistake? Well, for like really important conversations or discussions, what I would do is I would try to write down different discussion points so that I have a succinct summary in my head. And worst case, I could fall back on this discussion notes and pull up some of those notes. Other times when I'm like, okay, really, what I really have to rely on, like, speaking in front of people, what I would do is I would just like make up for this like weakness, like just practicing a lot before presenting or before speaking. So I will say that'll be probably my third weakness that I'm going to share with everyone here. But yeah, I hope this is like relatable to some of the people here. Things like being optimistic, being like perfectionist, or even just like not being a good communicator. I think communication skill is also like it's actually a very, very hard skill to be able to be good at it. And I think, if you feel like you're not, adapted like really excellent public communication, it's fine to like just admit it, how you're making up for it. And hopefully if you really recognize that this is a weakness, you could also spend time to kind of improve upon it. So then this becomes like less of your weakness over time.
That was a really good example, actually, especially for this group. Like, I don't want to assume how many of you like grew up first with English as a first language, not, but like that's something that's totally fair to share. That like, if it wasn't your first language, and like that's a fair thing to talk about.
All right. So, Kurt, are you done putting me on a spot?
Yes.
All right. Yeah. Well, as you could imagine, this is like a real interview question. I'll be probably even more nervous, right? Oh yeah. By the way, just accounting for like how nervous you get during the interviews could also be a good thing to think about. For example, like probably there like some like assumption or like mentality that you have about like how you're gonna behave, why you feel relaxed, versus like why you actually end up behaving, why you're being nervous and being put on the spot. So just thinking about that and thinking about how you can kind of relieve some of your nervousness, or thinking about how you can get used to some of that nervousness is important in doing the interview, right? So some things that I would recommend could include, of course, like practicing, as practicing would kind of give you some ideas about, okay, what kind of things you need to say or what kind of things you need to do. Yeah, and otherwise also just simulating an actual like a stressful situation, right, in a safe setting. So things like mock interviews, which I really recommend everyone to like set up with your mentors, could also simulate some of it. You could just say, hey, I would like to do a mock interview with you. Can you pretend that this is going to be a real one, and like make sure we have like a time bound, and you also like not and just asking the mentor, you also asking like some really grilling questions, so that you also kind of put in a tough spot during those like practices, and hopefully those practices will make you become more familiar to that kind of stress, and perform better during the real interviews. All right, if not, we'll just kind of wrap this presentation up with a few more slides. So other questions, what was the most challenging part of the project? Here you can kind of give concrete and detailed answers. So yeah, pretty straightforward answer. Some example here. An okay answer to this question would be, hey, I had to learn a lot of new languages and technologies. And you can kind of like imply that, hey, that must have been like a time consuming and really like hard effort things to do. But you could like really elaborate on it, right? So with like details. So you could say, hey, the biggest challenge was like fixing this bug that kept failing the app to fetch a new object from the API. We investigated code several times, but couldn't find the root cause. And we started to like test various pieces. And in the end, the root cause turned out to be the app's caching policy that made the app always use cache data instead of new data from the API. We didn't notice it before because it was the first time using this new API framework, and the configuration for this caching policy was not in the official documentation. This is actually a real story that I encountered in my work, where things were like just not behaving as we were expecting. So what we did here was like we basically set up a different hypothesis and just try to like eliminate each one of those hypotheses by testing in different ways. And in the end, it just ended up being this like really hidden part of the API that was not even documented. And there was like just like one line code configuration that we had to change to make sure the app was correcting as we're expecting them to be. But here, like you can see just by kind of going to details, like you really paint what the challenges were and how you went about solving it. And this really gives you kind of like much better picture to an interviewer. And in this case, like, okay, with this story telling, like you could tell them what a systematic like problem solver you are by saying that, okay, you basically had different hypotheses and went through each one to eventually get to the one that ended up being right. Oh yeah, and this is probably like everyone's favorite to fill up the time in the interview, which is like, what questions do you have for me? I mean, this is also like a really like a good opportunity for the candidate to really ask, how interested are you in the job, or to also like learn more about the job, right? So that's why you want to ask good questions here, and not just say, hey, I don't have any questions for you. So there are kind of like 3 question categories. First one is genuine questions. So genuine question basically means like, hey, you want to like, ask questions to like understand, more about day-to-day life, right? So example question could be something like, hey, how much of the day do you spend coding in? And what does the team composition look like, etc. Right? That basically like shows like, okay, that you generally want to know about this like, kind of work that you're aiming for. So moving on to the second question category is insightful questions. So insightful questions basically, basically kind of allows you to like demonstrate, specific insight that you may have, right? So some example is like, hey, I noticed that you use like technology X, like, how do you handle problem Y? Or like, you could also like really like say question here about like, okay, if a company is working on like microservices, you could ask questions like, hey, how do you think about SLA, which is known as like service level agreements, and what measures do you have to like maintain that level? This is kind of interesting because you're asking the question, but even like through asking these questions, you're also hinting to the interviewer about the knowledge you have that allows you to generate this kind of insightful questions, right? So this is also like a really helpful type of question categories to think about. And lastly, if you're a junior candidate and don't really have a deep domain knowledge, that's totally fine. You could still kind of like show that you have passion for it through like these like passion questions. So you want to ask this kind of question to demonstrate your passion for technology. So you could say things like, "Hey, I'm very interested in scalability. Did you come in a background with? Did you come in with a background in this, or what kind of opportunities did you have to learn about it, right?" Or you could say, "Hey, I'm not familiar with technology X, but it sounds like a very interesting solution. And could you tell me more about how it works?" Right? So some example of technology that I could come up with is like now a lot of companies are moving away from like a REST framework or REST API to using this like a new framework called GraphQL. If you know nothing about it except you have heard about it, you could also ask that question. It's like, hey, like you could say, "Hey, I heard that you guys are moving to like GraphQL for like to build a lot of these like endpoints. Can you tell me more about it? Because I know nothing about it." Right? I think that's totally fine because it's like it also kind of shows you how passionate you are about this technology. All right, so that wraps up the lesson for today. So we just kind of like move on to the Q&A section. But any questions so far about any of the things that we covered today?
Yeah, I have one question. So I guess in your guys' opinion, it might vary by company also, right? But how much do you think the behavioral part of an interview weighs versus the technical part?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, based on like the workplaces that I worked on, technical questions is mostly is like a requirement, like just being able to pass the technical questions and come to a working solution. So that's a requirement. In terms of like these behavior question, it's non-scientific, right? It only comes down to the human component, which is like how does different interviewers like feel about you as a potential colleague from having those conversations. If those like if your answers like all these like questions sounds like reasonable and sounds like okay, you have a nice colleague to work with, then I think that's just like a positive sign. Otherwise, if you answer in the wrong way, it could only hurt you. Like if you kind of like answer questions that kind of suggest that, hey, you may be difficult to work with during like, hard times, or you may be too hard to collaborate with, then even if you did super well in like technical interview, if you like, answer those behavior questions in a poor way, it would definitely hurt your chances, right? So that's, I think those are the common cases. I'll say maybe there's some other extreme positive cases where like, okay, hey, your technical performance may not have been like so hot, but then your answers to these behavior questions were like super insightful for like the interviewers. For example, like maybe you didn't do so well in like this like, like a technical interview question that was just given during the interview round, but maybe through these behavior questions, you answered in ways that really suggest you're like a database domain expert, since you have like really taken several classes on it. You even know how to like roll up your query counters and stuff. And that might be like, okay, well, maybe this candidate was nervous, but just based on the stories that we have heard, it sounds like this person knows a lot, especially about this technology. Then maybe we'll give him like, give that person like a benefit of doubt, or maybe we'll just like accept him anyway, or accept that, or accept her anyway, or like, things like that. So it could also help you in those ways as well.
The behavioral questions, are those asked like at the beginning of the technical like the 5 minutes we have, or is it like like a specific behavioral interview that they might have?
Oh, sorry, Harsha, Karan, do you want to take it?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. The question, in case anybody couldn't hear, was, will they ask behavioral questions at the start of a technical round or separately? And it does depend. I think there are some cases which are like explicitly dedicated to technical, like especially like the first couple rounds of software engineering interviews I've done will be like dedicated to that. Or if you do and this depends like company to company. Like if you do before a panel, like if you have a manager call, that might be like half and half. It might be like an hour, 30 minutes behavioral, 30 minutes technical, or like 20 for 45 minutes total. So you could have both in one, but generally what I've seen is they tend to focus on one or the other. And then in the panel, it'll be like 2 behavioral, 2 technical, and it's like 4 interviews total.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for these questions. Yeah, any other questions from other folks? We haven't heard that much from, folks like Sophia, Maria, David, Janice, Diana. Any other questions?
No, I think you guys did a great job. So yeah.
Well,
Yeah, pretty thorough.
Quick question, I guess. I was meeting with my mentors and looking over the resume, and they mentioned because my work experience, it does not relate to tech. However, some of the projects I worked on, they are more aligned to a tech field, that I reverse the spots, basically put the projects after the schooling and the skills and the work experience at the end. Do you think it's a good, it's something that might work?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think what we provided is like definitely not the go-to rubric for like every situation. Like you don't have to follow our examples to a T. Like that, it's just we're just providing like one example of how we've seen. Like that, I think overall, people are typically aligned with like school and education first. That's generally a good de facto, but like sometimes they put like work first, then school. Like that, it's up to you. And then in terms of like projects versus work versus like extracurriculars, that like you can have flexibility. I think as long as you have it organized into sections, like whatever the order of that section is, you can determine based on what the interview, like what the role or the candidacy looks like. But yeah, overall, it's like you have a lot of flexibility.
Do you think because I will switch those 2 fields, it will interfere with the parsing of the skills? Let's say that my resume gets picked up by a company and so forth, and usually they have like parsing or something of the skills of the code of everything. Do you think that might mess it up, or you think it might be okay?
No, I think it's more of like with the parse thing, it's more of like, is it on the resume versus is it not? It's not so much like where is it? Because like if you think about a parsing algorithm, it's going to go through the full document ideally. It's not going to go through like the first section, or else that would be like a pretty poor parsing algorithm, you know? So yeah, as long as it's on the doc, I think that's fine. And then it's up to you and like how you feel versus like what your experiences are versus like what they're looking for, how you want to structure the resume based on what they might be looking for. And also like one thing we didn't cover, but I think is like super important is you should have multiple versions of your resume depending on like what either the roles you're looking at or like the companies, like startup versus big tech, they might be different. Like big tech might care more about like having those extracurriculars and stuff, while like startups care a lot about projects. So those are like, I would highly recommend having different variations of your resume that you have on file.
I guess one other comment I would like to add, I recently heard that like your LinkedIn profile or like any links that you are using, it's good to have them as hyperlinks in your resume. So the recruiters, I heard that they don't have a lot of time, so they can simply click on it rather than copying and pasting it. So I thought that was good advice.
Yeah, that is a good tip. That's a great tip to share.
Well, thank you guys.
Yeah, actually, Wental, do we want to do LinkedIn stuff now, or do we want to do it later? Because like I can share screen and walk through LinkedIn if we want.
Okay. Yeah, great. If you like, yeah, you want to do that right now, that's fine.
Yeah, I think it's fine. We can do that. I
Sounds
think
good.
let me see if I can share. Yeah, I think you need to stop sharing, and then I think I can share.
Okay, sounds good. Let me
Oh,
do
I see
that.
Wilmer. Wilmer also asked about cover letters. Yeah, so I've heard honestly like so many mixed things about cover letters, and so that I don't have a great answer for you for, but like for engineering roles, typically they don't necessarily check cover letters, but then I see like random edge cases where they do. And so if you have like a cover letter template that's not too hard to make, and like you can just fill in the details, I would say it's not the worst thing. For like whenever I've done that job interviews, it's more been like the effort for putting it in. But I think in hindsight, I realize like that effort, like at worst case, they don't read it, but at best case, it helps you get your foot in the door. And so it couldn't hurt. So I would say if you have one on file and it's easy to customize, I would say keep it on hand. For GPA, I see Eduardo asked about that. Yeah, you should keep that in your education section for sure. And then depending on like if you have like your overall GPA versus like your major GPA. So like for instance, in my case, my major GPA is better than my overall GPA. I include both. But depending on like you can include whichever, if you should always include your overall. And then like if your major happens to be better, you can include that too, especially if it is technical. So like I study computer science, so I include that because it's relevant. What is considered a good GPA? I mean, that is a pretty flexible question. Like companies don't necessarily, big companies are sometimes a little arbitrary about their like GPA cutoffs, like three and above. But other companies, like if it's not that high, and like if you personally don't feel like it's high enough, then like it's up to you whether you want to include it. But generally, I would say include it. But it should not be a determining factor. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's great. I think a 3.5, yeah, 3.5 solid. Definitely. I would include that.
Yeah, I would say to kind of like follow up on, yeah, if you really feel not that confident about your GPA, that's totally fine. I mean, I think, some of the companies such as Google are like publishing the fact that, hey, there's not that much of a strong correlation between your GPA and actual like your job performance. And they're also like taking that fact into their hiring practices. So yeah, it's like, hey, you feel like you don't have a stellar GPA and you feel like, that could have potentially hurt your chance of like, getting a look from your interviewer. Then yeah, I mean, you could also like leave it out and just like really emphasizing on like all your other positive aspects. Yeah, because like unless companies have like a really hard GPA requirement, then I think most companies don't really care about your GPA and just care more about your background. So yeah, it could go both ways, guys.
Cool. Well, if there are any other questions, feel free to keep putting them in the chat, but I will go ahead and share my screen. Let's do it. All right. Can you guys see my screen? You can just give a thumbs up or say yes.
Yes.
Awesome.
Good.
All right. Cool. So welcome to LinkedIn. If you do not already have an account, I highly recommend you make an account. If you do have an account, that's great. You already have done the first step. Yeah, so I would recommend definitely making a LinkedIn if you don't have one already. And I think your mentors will also, like during the resume review, we'll also encourage you to make a LinkedIn because the resume and the LinkedIn go pretty much hand in hand. And so with LinkedIn, in case you haven't already seen it, there's a lot of various info that's included. First is like your headliner. So like, what do you do? Like, what is your current job? Or like, if you're a student, where do you go to school? Or if you're doing part-time work, you can include both. So like that's up here. Then it'll go, what shows up here is going to be your current education and or current work. So that's what you will see here. Then if you are looking for a job, then you should click open to, oops, not that one. Oh, it's because I already have it open. Where is it? Let me delete. Oh, okay. Let me delete this so I can redo it. Okay. So if you go to, you should see under your name, this open to, and then it'll say finding a new job. And then when you're looking for finding your job, you include the title. So you could say like software engineer. You could add that there. You can include compensation if you wish, and that like gives recruiters who see it a sense of like what you're looking for, as well as any benefits, as well as location. This used to be a little bit nicer before, but now it's purely based on zip code. So if you care about being in a certain geography, you can include a zip code, as well as like the radius from that zip code. As well as like there's additional details we've been adding, like schedule, part-time, full-time. I think there's something about remote too, but I don't think it's on this part. But then at the bottom is the key part. The bottom is if you want to share this with just recruiters, or if you want to share this with all like members in your profile to share like, hey, I'm looking for a job. If you can help me out, that would be great. So like if you're in a current job right now, like if Wentao were doing this right now and he was looking for his next thing, I don't think he would put the open to work because he's in a job currently. But like if you guys as students, if you're interested in looking for a job, this doesn't hurt. So like it would show you the open to work and it would show like this little banner. You can't see it too well, but it says open to work. So that that your connections can see that you're interested in getting a job. And so when you click on this, so like let's just do this for me. I'll just say product manager. I always forget what's in New York City's zip code. Wentao, do you have one?
Oh, yeah, that one.
1001.
Yeah,
there we go. Yeah,
you have a really good zip code.
yeah. Let's just do that. Add the profile. Boom. And so then it shows, if I refresh, it'll show like my next job will show for me this. Then let's go to the actual components of the profile. So the components of the profile, when you click on, they've made it a little messy recently. Here we go. So summary experiences. Oh, that's not what I want. Where's add section? Oh, add section. Here we go. So these are the different sections of your profile. So one is like having a profile photo, which I highly recommend everybody here has a profile photo because that tends to be more useful when people look at your LinkedIn. If you don't have a LinkedIn profile photo, I think it's like an unfortunate thing. I think we're trying to establish a better practice, but for the most part, people do prefer being able to see a profile photo that you have. Then in your about section, if you want to, you can include a summary. So you could say like, I am a rising senior at Santa Cruz, at University of California, Santa Cruz, studying computer science. I lead this club. I work on this I've interned at X, Y, and Z, and I am knowledgeable in like these computer languages. So like those are examples of things you can include in the summary. I wouldn't make it longer than like 5 sentences probably. I think you want to keep it like pretty short and crisp. And like the summary is optional. Like I personally don't have one. I don't know if Wentao does, but it's up to you whether you want to have one. It doesn't hurt. I've just never like thought too hard about it. Then in your next section, you'll want to do, this is a new thing, which I actually have not done yet, which is if there are any, actually, never mind. That is not, if there's any, here we go, background. So work experience is where you put in like your actual experience. And so like I can scroll down. So like let's see, let me show a good example. So like this was like a software engineering internship I did, and where I talk about like what projects I worked on, and the detail you put in the work experience is up to you. Like you don't have to give too in-depth of a summary because there's like 2 schools of thought about LinkedIn. One is you can have it be exactly parallel your resume, in which case you put the same level of granularity. The other is you keep it more high level, and like it's meant to just be like a quick snapshot that complements your resume at a glance. And so when you click on new experience, you could have like your role, so like software engineer, employment type. It would be like if it's full-time, part-time, freelance, internship, whatever detail you want to provide, and then the company, and the location. And then you put like your start and end dates, or if it's current, you click current. And then with the description, this is like, it's up to you whether you want to go that granular. Like I don't think you have to go as granular as you are on your resume. Just because with LinkedIn, what's nice is like, and this is like my mine is a little bit longer, I think, because now I've had like a couple more years of experience, but generally like you want it to be discarded. Generally like you want to be able to like glance through all your experiences, and so like these are all my experiences with like 2 to 3 lines about like each thing. Like you don't need to go too in depth with like the full bullets. But some people, they like having it be exactly mirroring their resume. There's perks to either. And you can also include your resume as a attachment in your LinkedIn profile too. If you go to, where is it? Add section, add, where is featured? Oh yeah, here we go. So like if you want to show like certain links, photos, or like sites you've been featured on, or projects, like your GitHub, for instance, you can include it here under your featured section. Yeah, and that was under add section, as well as like any post you've made, any articles you've been in, any other content, like even if you've done like a YouTube video, like that's great. So that's featured. And then background, we can go down to education. Education is like where you went to school, so you can include your what is it, your major, like your GPA. Optional, I do not have it, but some people have it, as well as just like what are some of the organizations or like clubs you've been in, as well as any like coursework. I think relevant coursework is super helpful, because to the point earlier about parsing, like being able to show like I've done like an AI course, I've done an ML course, I've done data science, like those are helpful things to look for. And like recruiters will look for that. So relevant coursework you should definitely include. I would not do more than like 3 to 4. Yeah. And then for I do not have any licenses, but you can also include licenses and certifications. If you go back to add section, license and certification, and you can put the name of the license, put the issuing organization, as well as like if there's an expiration, as well as the ID. The ID is somewhat useful to add a slight validity, because like LinkedIn does try to like put a nice little badge on your profile if you do have a certain credential. So if you have that ID in the URL, that's helpful, but it's not required. What else? Oh, then skills are super useful as well. Like whatever programming languages you know, and here you can be more flexible. I think with your resume, they like, because the skills section is like a huge section of LinkedIn. It's not like a resume where it's like 2 lines. So whatever programming languages you know, you should feel free to include. And like if you want, you can have your connections endorse you. So like I was endorsed by my friend Samir, who's a software engineer at LinkedIn. And like you can ask people to endorse you. I have to remember how you ask for endorsements. If I
they just go on your profile, and there's like a little, like for them there's gonna be like a little plus button by the skill.
Yep, exactly. So here I know we talk a lot about like programming languages that you like. If it's on your resume, you should be like very familiar with it. But if it's on your LinkedIn, you have a little more flexibility. So the more the better, I always say. And then what's also nice is with skills, we had a new function called take a skills quiz. So you can actually add a little, similar to the license and certification, you can take a little quiz on like say a programming language or like a concept. And if you do well, it will add a badge to your profile. And so that just adds like a sign of validation that like, hey, here's proof that I am like, I know what I'm talking about when it comes to like this skill. So I highly recommend doing some skills badges. So I did one for Python, and then like there's others you could do as well, depending on like what skill it is. Then what else? Projects is another one. These we don't use as much anymore. I think I don't know how often recruiters use them, but like you can add courses. So like I added, like I couldn't fit all those courses in this top summary. So you can add more of them in the courses section, as well as like some projects. So like I did 2 projects, I added my 2 collaborators. And then any awards, any other languages you speak, any other organizations, or like any publications you've been in, those are all helpful stuff. And then, yeah, that's mostly it for the profile. Any questions here before I go to the jobs tab?
You have a question for like leadership positions that you hold, like when you're in college. Do you put that in the experience, or do you put that in the volunteer?
Good question. I would put it in experience while you're a student. So like, yeah, if you are a student, you should totally put in experience, because it is not fair to assume that you have done much like work experience outside of college. So yeah, because Wentow and I, we are now 4 years out of college. We
Yeah.
do not have that anymore. But like when I was in college, I had like a bunch of these were listed in my experience section, because those
Yeah,
are
so-
like similar to the question before about the behavioral interviews. Like when you're asked about like, tell me about a time you did this. Like I had like negligible examples of from work.
Yeah.
But like I had a bunch of like organizations I was in college where I was like fundraising for a club or like leading an event. Like those are comparable skill sets, but just not in a formal work environment.
Yeah, so right now I have like 5 experiences related to software engineering. So should I
Okay.
still put my organization, like my leadership positions on there?
That's a good question. If you already have a bunch, like I would say you use it as like filler. So if
I
you
see.
don't have a lot, but if you feel pretty good, and like I saw yours right before this, like yours is pretty solid. So yeah, there's no pressure to like excessively add, because as I mentioned earlier, like
Yeah.
you want to have like, let's see, how many do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like 5 is how many you see on like the first glance before you have to click more experiences. So you don't want to like overstuff it, especially when you're in
Yeah.
college. So like if you have like your the 5 things you want to focus on the most, I would include, and then anything else can go under volunteer experiences. You can mention it under education. You can mention it under, there's also an organization section, but again, that's like another one that's more of a legacy. Well, actually, yeah, we do have organization. So I would include it under, like if you have it under your work experience, I think just make sure it doesn't get drowned out. Make sure it doesn't drown out your actual work experience.
Yeah.
But if otherwise, put it under education or volunteer.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. I think I saw some others in the chat.
Yeah, I wrote 2 questions in the chat box. The first one is like, if you are not like actively seeking for a job, but if something came up, you would probably do it. Would you still like say like open to work? Like, is that, like just like have it there, like, like throughout the school year,
Yeah,
I'm
for
probably
sure.
going to be doing stuff, but if something would come up, I would probably, yeah.
No, that's a great question. That's why like the one I did where it's open to, and I didn't put it on everyone. That makes it where is it? Because it's just with recruiters, it's not going to be like blasted to everybody. Only like recruiters will reach out to you, and then you can like decide whether or not you want to pursue it. So there's like less pressure to be like, hey, I'm like actively looking here. Like here's a sign on my head that I'm looking for jobs. So you can just put it like this, and you can just then like manage the inbound messages that come in from recruiters. Does that
Okay,
help?
thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Your other question was about Udemy. Oh, Udemy is great. Like any online courses you do are super useful. I've done a couple Udemy courses. Like that's how I learned SQL. And so those are good. You can, the thing is like, I've never done online courses like with the intent of having the certificate. I think if you have the option to do so, because like sometimes they make you pay for the certificate. So it's like up to you if you want to have that or not. I think it's not a bad investment, especially like if it's something that you're not learning in the classroom. So if you have the courses, then yes, you should definitely add them. I don't know if I can, I think I can add them anyways. Let me try to add one. Licenses, certification, Udemy, SQL bootcamp. Okay, I think if I don't think I've done one with like a official certification, but yeah, if you do have one, I would definitely like recommend adding it, because it's just like another badge to your profile that shows that's representative of like a skill, and adds like credibility to it. Because in the end, what LinkedIn helps you do is it helps you add credibility to the skills and experiences that you have. Because a resume, you can't really do that, right? Everything's just on paper. That like this is like you just have to trust the person's judgment, and then that's like sussed out during the interview. But with LinkedIn, it helps you establish a bit more credibility with what you do.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, great questions. Keep them coming as I go through, because now let me go to the, oops, Zoom is such a pain. How do I move this? Come on. Oops, come on. One sec, let me reshare. All right, here we go. So everything I talked about is just like your profile, but the profile is just part of LinkedIn. The other piece, if you're looking for jobs, is the jobs piece. So the jobs piece is where you have a lot of cool features, and like you only see a couple of them, but there's a lot of others that you can also see as well. And so like when you go to jobs, oh, they also like just redone it. Nice. I like having worked at LinkedIn. There's maybe like my profile has like a couple of like new features that you might not necessarily see, but for the most part, this should be accurate. So when you go to the job section, you'll see your recent job searches. You'll see like any jobs you've saved. So like for instance, I saw a what did I see? Like I saw like a cool job at Spotify, and I was like, oh, I should save this in case I'm interested in applying later. But like you just do have to be mindful of like what the timeline is, otherwise you miss it like I did. So like that's where you see where you saved your jobs. Job alerts is when you are searching. So like for me, I said New York, University, United States, looking for product manager, and so like it saves that, and it'll now like send me batch emails based on any jobs that come in that could like match my profile to some degree, and then it gives me the option to apply. So I highly recommend turning this on. You can set the cadence in your notification settings. So if you go to the top right hand corner for settings, you can set the notification settings. So like if it's daily, weekly, or some other cadence. Oh, actually, no, it's here. So yeah, so like alert frequency, you can make it daily or weekly, as well as getting notified either by email or notification. So I would recommend you do that. And then you will see, because I have LinkedIn Premium, it services some of these other jobs that are like could be a good fit that I'm not necessarily looking for, but other ones that are recommended will appear here. And then besides like the jobs themselves, there's also a lot of cool other features. So for instance, if you're interested in like salary, this gives you a sense of like what potential salary potentially might have depending on the role you're looking at, as well as if you go to the skills assessment, that goes back to your profile. And it goes back to what I just showed you, like taking skills tests adds a little badge for that skill. And then if I go back to here, these are like less used, but they're like pretty useful. One is a resume builder. So if you want to upload your resume, if you want to create a new resume from your profile, you can actually have professionals, like you can actually get feedback either from the platform or from professionals. The professionals though, you do potentially have to pay. So I would not necessarily do that if you don't want to pay. That's why you have your mentors, because they can do that for free. So that is just another cool feature. And then the interview prep is also pretty cool. Interview prep, it's a lot of behavioral questions. We do not have technical, but that's where you have like HackerRank and LeetCode and others that do that. But like there's a ton of cool behavioral components, behavioral questions with like example answers that are sometimes shown. And you can also like practice and get feedback. I see a question in the chat. What do we got? Question in the chat. Weird. I don't know why it's not showing.
There's a question. He just said that he had to sign off.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Cool. So this is LinkedIn. And when you do your next session with your mentors, you should go through the resume. You should also make a LinkedIn if you don't have one already. And then my request to you all is in the directory. Let me pull that up. In the directory, I would ask that you mentors, where's directory? Linked file.
Oh, correct. I think it's just, yeah, there we go. I was going to just mention you haven't shared the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Come on. Why is this being a pain? Let's open this. Okay, there we go. In the directory, I will ask that all of you add your LinkedIn links to column 8 of the fellows tab, just so like we can have them. And because like we don't formally work with recruiters yet, but we have like some informal recruiters in our network. And so like we can just shoot them everybody's LinkedIn profiles for them to look at. and potentially get you interviews. So the sooner you can add those in, the better.
Sounds good.
Cool. Any questions? I know I just gave you a lot of info about LinkedIn.
No, this is really cool. Even I learned a lot from you about LinkedIn today. So thanks for this, Karen.
For sure. For sure.
Thank you.
Awesome. And I know we're a couple minutes over. So with that, I think we can call it. If you have any questions, feel free to Slack us or email us, and we will talk to you next week.
Just a
Appreciate
quick
it.
question. Where's the directory for that LinkedIn thing?
Yeah, the directory sheet is,
To the drive.
yeah, I think you're in the link. It's on column E.
All right, yeah, we'll have a good week.
Oh, okay.
See you next week.
Have a good
Awesome.
weekend.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.